There we go. So we're recording. I'll angle this way. And we're going to start this one off again by looking at some images. Okay. Let's start with this little fella. Okay. What is it?
Teddy bear.
Teddy bear. Ooh, we got two answers. It's a bear or is it a teddy bear?
It's a stuffed bear.
It's a stuffed bear. Stuffed teddy bear, right? We call it a bear, right? Obviously, none of us started screaming and running away, right? So I want to talk a little bit about perception today, like what we are dealing with, and almost what we have to unlearn is things that we take for granted, right? We were talking the other day about the train coming into the station and all of the people who were watching that film back in the early 20th century, started screaming and running out of the tent because they were worried they were going to get ran over by a train, right? And sort of in the same way, right? Like a photograph of a bear 200 years ago, or a photograph of anything, would have been pretty amazing, right? We'd only seen interpretations of all of that stuff. Painting had gotten to a very high quality element, but this is just a picture. Right? We captured some light on a piece of paper that had some chemicals on it that were light sensitive, and we get a photo representation of a bear, right? So let's just talk for a second about this teddy bear. What's it doing? Just sitting there, right? Staring deeply into your soul. Right? So when we were talking the other day about the characters jumping off of the cart and the little kid dragging the goat head or whatever, we were using action words. This bear's not really doing anything, right? How do we know? How do we know he's not in the process of lunging at us?
There's no way to indicate that there's emotion going on.
So yeah, there's no telltale signs of motion. Like, what are some of those signs? So motion blur, not sitting, right? Like, he's not in it's not in a pose that would indicate motion. What is motion blur? When we use the word motion blur, what does that phrase mean?
When something is moving faster and it looks slightly fuzzy, so you draw it or paint it just slightly, like out of focus, slightly to make it look like it's moving.
Yeah. So why do we see that? Like for technical reasons, why do we see motion blur in a picture? Okay, let's find something with some motion blur in it. Why are we seeing this? Huh? It's a fast dog, right? Did everybody see what this image is? Like, what is happening in this? I heard some answers. What was it? The dog's running.
Well, if it was just the dog running, then that would be the only thing that's blurred. But since everything is blurred, it's like the person with the camera is like trying to keep up with the dog while that's your moving back and forth.
Yeah. So it's a dog running during an earthquake, or the person is moving the camera too, right? So it's a dog and the camera moving, right? The reason we see motion blur is because when we have that piece of film, or like if we were capturing it on real film, it's light sensitive chemicals. When you expose them to light, it burns that image in there. But the amount of light changes how long you have to expose it, right? And so if it's not really bright and your camera's moving a little bit or the object's moving a little bit, we're going to get a little bit of blur on that, right? If we look at this picture, right, it's kind of the opposite thing happening here, right? The ground is very crisp, means the camera was still, right? But the characters are running pretty quickly, right? And so that means there's this blur on them because the shutter was the shutter was open long enough to expose the film while that object was moving, right? If these people were just standing there, they would seem perfectly crisp, like that bear, right? And so that's one of the things that we see as sort of a telltale sign of motion in an image, right? But yet again, nothing is moving in this image. Like, we're not going to ever see any motion in this. This is just a still image, right? Having said that, we can build the illusion of motion into that still image. And we do it with some of these tricks. We do it with that blur. We also do it with the, as you said, like the bear in the previous one was sitting, right? That's not usually a pose that says, run away, it's coming right at us, right? Like that's a very stationary pose. Whereas standing on one leg is not, right? Like, there's something about this pose that tells us that these characters are running, right? Which direction do you think they're running? Toward me, right? Over here. How do we know that? Or how do we suspect that?
Direction the characters are facing.
Right. Usually people don't run marathons backwards, right?
Yeah.
So we're using some logic there, right? So I want you to recognize that all of these things are part of the language we use to decipher images when we look at them, right? If you show this image to a newborn baby, doesn't care, doesn't understand it. This is the first time it's seen the world. It doesn't understand how to use its eyes right. Probably can't even see this very well. A lot of this stuff is coming to you through context, right? You learn the language of motion blur. That's not something that has been like ingrained in you since birth, right? The fact that this is blurry comes from you learning over time that when you see an image that's blurry, it was because something was moving, right? Even if you don't know the technical reasons of how a camera works. I recognize I'm still using film as an example. Light sensitive sensors in a digital camera are pretty much they work very similarly. So we recognize that these people are running or likely running forward because of the direction their shoes are pointing, right? There's a good chance that they're moving backwards, right? But situations tell us a little bit about the motion that's happening. This one has no motion blur in it at all. So is this kid floating? Yes, he is. This is Rocket Kid. He just floats around everywhere he goes, defies gravity. We know that more than likely this kid is moving just because of the situation he's in. We've never seen a kid floating around like this before, right? We understand that there are laws of... Am I recording this? Yeah, we understand that there are laws of physics that govern the world around us, right? And that we have never seen in our life anybody defy them in this way. So likely what happened is somebody took the picture while he was midair in a jump, right? And I want to point this out, that this is important to understand. Like, we all, like, everything I've said so far today, you're like, yeah, Greg, I know I'm not an idiot, right? But the thing about that is you will make idiot mistakes if you're not thinking about these things, right? Like, these are tools, just like you understand how to use, letters and numbers, right? These are tools for communication. And how we use those is up to us. So, like, this kid, like, we could show motion in a single image just by the situation. Just like that kid, or that person stepping off of that cart in that painting we were looking at, right? And we can use that in our art. Right? When we see this image, there are so many telltale signs of motion, just from context, from the way it's illustrated, right? Which direction is this character falling? Down, right? In our world here, like, we're kind of askew, so it looks like down is kind of toward this corner, right? But we can kind of get some of that information based off of the direction this character seems to be traveling, right? Based off of the direction his clothes seem to be dragging, right? and like based off of sort of the orientation of this character, right? They don't necessarily have a ton of motion blur in here. Maybe a little bit like back here, you can kind of think of these trails here a little bit as motion blur. But there's a lot of motion in this image. I'll also point out that there's a lot of motion in how you look at this image, right? So you may not necessarily feel it. It may not be a conscious event that's happening to you, but your eyes travel around this scene in a very specific way. And that motion, that like the way that the artist is leading your eye is also a way that they get that motion out of here, right? If you kind of notice the way that these clouds are situated, we get this curve that kind of draws this circle around this character, and we continue to like kind of travel our eyes around the scene in this circle. This land down here kind of keeps us from going off the empty page, or this part of the page, so it kind of takes up some of that information there. And the artist is able to use a whole bunch of tiny tricks to keep you looking at this and keep your eye engaged in this motion and in this scene for a long time, right? Like you could look at this picture for a while. There's a lot of kind of interesting stuff going on in here. Little things that you may just only slightly notice, like this gun is kind of leading your eye straight to this other character, right? There's all sorts of little things happening in here, right? None of that existed at one time. This was not something that someone captured. This is something someone was able to create because they understood the language of motion. They understood how to use motion blur, how to use drag, how to use pose, how to use composition, how to use sort of staging, all of these different things to convey a feeling of motion to you, right? The thing to remember is that motion is like with film, right? You pick up a camera, you point it at stuff, motion happens. You don't have any control of that motion. Just motion happens, right? Like that's, if you listen to documentary filmmakers talk, the way they make films is to observe for a long period of time, not to interact, and then wait for the things that are important to communicate. So basically they tell stories by waiting for long periods of time for the thing they need to happen. They didn't just like go out one afternoon, start filming those penguins, and everything that they needed to happen happened, right? There's probably like hundreds of hours of footage that they could edit down into one movie. We, on the other hand, start with nothing. Animators start with nothing. And they have to craft every bit of that motion. But they can craft it exactly the way they want it to happen. Now, making things move in animation is easy. Like we already learned it, S, right? Hit S, move it, hit S, you're done, right? It's moving. Making it move the way you want to, learning this language of communication and making something move in exactly the manner you want it to move, that's really hard. That's what you spend 4 years here learning to do. I've already taught you how to animate, you hit S, right? Now we're going to spend 4 more years learning how to animate well. I tell you this because it's like our bodies are very intricate. Like they move in very interesting ways. There's a very different, a huge difference between this gesture and this gesture, right? And what that even implies, how our subconscious reads that when we see those gestures, right? This is very offering, like offertory, is that a word? I made that word up if I didn't, so trademark Greg Marlowe. Offertory, this is very dismissive, right? Why is that, right? Like, why does that communicate that way? These are the things that you learn. So the first thing we start with is learning how to communicate with images, right? Because despite all of the complexity of Maya, when it's all said and done, the only thing the viewer sees is images, right? Like, they're not going to see the S that you hit weeks before, right? They're going to see a bunch of images that flash at their face, right? So this is a lot of things to study here about how still images convey motion. Um, let's go just a little further here and look at how we can convey motion with a few images, right? So what's happening here? The orange rolled off the books, or somehow like moved from those books, right? When we see these two images side by side, like this is something that's really weird. You can hand this to like a 4-year-old, and like they kind of understand comics. Like as long as they can kind of figure out the way to read, like the direction to read, right? Like the in this case, we're going from right to or from left to right, right? Then they understand this as a story. I'm sure if you hand this to a kid from an Asian country, they're going to read it from right to left and be like, how did that orange get up on those books, right? Which is an interesting story, but seeing a sequence of images seems to like be something we naturally just understand as the passage of time, right? We do not think that this is two very coincidental images of two different shelves at two completely different times that happen to have the same exact books. It's the first two books on the Hunger Games series, if you're curious. And two different oranges, right? This is not like this picture was taken in 2012 and this was taken in 2013. Two completely different oranges from two completely different groves, two completely different seasons. We just assume that when we see a bunch of elements that are similar and one element changes, then what we're conveying here is the passage of time, right? And so that's just sort of automatically our brain kind of makes that assumption, right? We don't imagine that this orange was destroyed from space and somehow another one rematerialized, right? Because we've never seen that happen, right? And one of the things that really kind of helps this is this little bitty gap right there in the middle. Right? Anybody know what that's called? No, it's the gutter. Right? I guess a lot of comic artists will call that the panels now. Like you break that up into panels, right? But that little gap that happens in there, that's where actually the magic happens. Because we see an image, and it's separated by a little bitty space, and then we see a new image, right? And your brain does a lot with that little bitty space. Your brain finishes the story. Your brain connects the dots, right? There's actually a great book called Understanding Comics. Anybody ever read that? Scott McCloud? Scott McCloud's an awesome comic artist. And there actually was a great graphic novel I just finished called The Sculptor, too. It's probably like one of my top 5 favorite graphic novels in the history of time. So he explains a lot of this, how we understand comics, and how they work so much differently than every other media. But this is, at its simplest level, the way animation works, too, right? The difference between panels and frames isn't that much different. The only difference is it doesn't have a gutter. Like the machine, the animation does that part for you, right? So if like that gutter right there can separate a fraction of a second, right? Or it can separate literally centuries, right? We can cut from Stone Age time to people in outer space, like in spacesuits, right? Depending on how you use that gutter can be like your brain just connects those dots. It says there's a relationship between these two images, and I'm going to fill in all of those gaps, right? And it's an extremely like versatile form of communication too. I feel like it's just a tease right now to not show you some comics, right? So we learned these pretty early. How many of you started reading comics in the newspaper when you were a kid? I recognize like we're a few years away from that sentence not even making sense anymore. The newspaper. This is how I got hooked. It's how most people get hooked. How many of you like comic books now? How many of you like read comic books? Anybody got any favorites? Because I'm needing more stuff to read. Yes.
I just got into this graphic novel called The Adventure Zone.
Oh.
Have you heard the podcast though?
Yeah, I've
That's-
started listening to those. They are so good.
How far are you?
Like I think I just finished 52.
Oh,
I thought we
She
should.
just got into them, just through the first 52. Yes, all of you are affected by comic books because you can't get the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like it's everywhere now, right? Like you step in it when you go outside. Comics are really impactful because they're a strong storytelling media. And I think a lot of people kind of like, oh, I don't read comics. I only read good literature. Well, yeah, you need to smack those people with a copy of Mouse and be like, yeah, this thing deserves a freaking Pulitzer. Yes.
When I was school, there's actually a literature teacher who designed a class around the literature and comic books.
Yeah.
With that, the street comic book you just mentioned, that's the textbook.
Understanding comics?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've considered making it the textbook for this class. It is like I will say I have copies of it, I think, in my office. I know I have 3 or 4 copies of it. It is like, if you want to understand how visual art works on a mechanical level, like, it is probably the best book I've ever read for that.
I've read that before too, and it's in this.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, we have to read a little bit of it.
Oh, that's cool. The Norton Reader. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's a great book.
The other one's good too. I don't remember what it was called. Making comics by the same guy.
He did 3 of them. He did Understanding, Making, and Reinventing comics. And Reinventing was kind of like, we're in a new world now where comics can actually have motion in them. Do we put motion in them? Comics can be digital in ways that mean you can choose where they go if you want to. Do we do that? Like, anyway, he's great. So I always loved the Bloom County comics. Opus is hilarious, and in the '80s, they were a very like, that's when I kind of grew up. I was a kid in the '80s. They were a very lighthearted way of looking at popular culture and politics, right? And then Berkeley breathed, just kind of said, "All right, I'm done, retiring for a while." Actually, within the last 5-ish years, 4 or 5 years, he just decided to come back, and he started making some very timely, poignant comics about very important stuff. This is one of the ones from the '80s. But if you get a chance, look some of them up. Some of them are extremely impactful during some of the mass shootings. Some of his responses to those, they almost hurt to look at. They're so beautiful. And you shouldn't, people don't expect you to say that about the thing that's right next to Garfield, right? Garfield's good too, but there's some amazing, impactful art out there. And I think it's important to recognize that that we're seeing this as a story, right? We're telling stories, little bitty short stories, that are fun, but carry a lot of weight. Right? People cried during the last Calvin and Hobbes. I know, because I was one of them, right? And I think on top of that, comics can be super simple. Every one of you is capable of making a comic right now at this level, right? This is XKCD. It's a super popular comic. And it's literally stick figures, right? There are people, later this semester, I'm going to encourage you to come to the portfolio reviews, which is the graduating seniors. One of our graduating seniors is currently making a web comic. He's doing it 1 page at a time and sending it out as a newsletter. If you are interested, it is called, sorry, because I got the email about it, it's a Turbo Action Pony Force, and it is pretty solid, right? This is part of digital media. Anyway, I want to let you know the many directions this can go. One of the art director I worked with at Firaxis, he's not the art director anymore, but he has 2 or 3 different web comics that are going and relatively popular. So So we're using this though to show the passage of time and to tell a story. And there's some interesting elements in comics, right? But we recognize, like from this pose and sort of the subtext, the squirrel is ringing, and the guy walks over and picks it up, like, and we can tell that just from that little gap there, right? So anyway, we'll move on from there, because comics are, in their own way, interactive. Right? You can control them, right? You can read them as fast or as slow as you want. You can stop at any time and go back a few panels. You can, it's an interactive media, right? You are in control of how you experience that comic, right? My wife, she reads them all the way through, and then she goes back and looks at every page again just for the images, right? I have a tendency to read a few panels ahead and then go back and make sure I didn't miss anything important in the images. And then some people look at a panel and then read the text, and like however you do that, but I'm sure any of you who have read comics have experienced your ability to jump back and look at the previous panel. I have a bad habit of rushing to the end and missing some of the subtlety of how those panels change, right? But we are able to control that. We are the person who controls time in comics, right? Which makes it interactive. Once something starts having time built into it, it becomes passive. You get no control over that because you can't slow time down, right? So I thought I'd throw some trippy stuff up here. I'll take this down in a minute because eventually some of you will start getting dizzy. This is a GIF, right? Some of you pronounce it GIF. I honestly don't judge. I don't care. So what is this? Like, how does this work? Let's get another one up here so we can kind of... How do these, like, what are these? Oh, there we go.
Like, it's a short animation where the first frame and the last frame are the same, so it looks like it's an action repeating itself.
And, but what many of you'll notice is that it's an image, though, right? It's an image that seems to be moving. It's not a video. Your computer will recognize it as an image format. In fact, I'm pretty sure GIF stands for graphical image format, or graphic image format. And so when we look at them, when we look at an image, it's just a bunch of pixels, right? Like on the screen, those pixels will never change, just like that's how a JPEG works, right? Just like a Polaroid or any other type of physical photograph works, it's never going to change. This has sort of some time built into it, right? This was created, I don't remember exactly when it was created, but it became very popular in the late 90s. And the reason it became popular is because the internet still sucked, right? Internet download speeds were too slow to share videos very effectively, but people still wanted to communicate with the passage of time. So they made GIFs, and GIFs just allowed them to have a few images that would change over time. And they realized that they kind of got more bang for their buck if you looped that, right, if it was something that repeated. And so a GIF may literally just be 5-10 images. Like it's not a ton of information, right? And they just play in sort of rapid succession. A lot of times they're playing at a really slow frame rate. Like some GIFs you'll see, they play at like 2 frames a second or less. And sometimes they're playing pretty smoothly. I think this is probably, I'm guessing this is 12 or 24. Right? But again, a GIF is just a series of images that change over time, right? If we look at this, like this one's got a little bit of a hitch to it, but this is just 5 or 6 images of a ball in a different spot on the screen, right? And I think it's important to recognize that the reason we, here's one that kind of changes a little slower. Actually, I think this was from one of my previous classes. So that frame rate wasn't very smooth, right? Whereas something like this feels just like a still image, but has something very subtle in it, right? So this became a really interesting media, a really interesting, like I would call it an art form, right? People started using this to communicate over the internet. Sometimes they're communicating some very like crude and not interesting stuff, but sometimes it's being used in ways that make you go, "Oh, that's neat." Right? Can I? Next one? Oh, that's not. That's not one of them. We'll talk about that one here in just a minute. So they're leveraging both the abilities of still image and and motion to create something pretty neat, right? Now I wanna be clear about something, and this is let's find another one to look at here. Yeah. Actually, let's just go ahead and look through a few more here. I think that one's neat. I'm gonna skip through a few. This one's kind of nice and trippy. And then we'll go back and sort of settle on this one. So, here's really the meat and potatoes of what we're here for. Those boxes are not moving, right? Just like you all drew something on a piece of paper and then you drew another one, right? That's how you made your flip book. None of those images moved. What we're doing is we're using more visual language again. We're using tricks of the mind. If you look back at any, you'll see a lot in film books and stuff like that. They tell you that the reason you understand this as motion is called persistence of vision. That's wrong, and I don't know why people keep saying it. Persistence of vision just means that the image that you see, like whenever you see an image, it kind of burns it into the back of your eye, and it stays there for a fraction of a second, right? It doesn't just immediately go away. It persists after it's sort of burned into those rods and cones, or those rods and cones, whatever it is your eye does to it, right? There was a stretch of time when persistence of vision was sort of first understood, that when people were murdered, the murderers would cut their eyes out because they were worried that the detectives could find their image on the back of people's eyes, right? Persistence of vision is something that happens in your eye, but it's not why you understand motion. Because if it was, then just by putting a gap in the frame rate that is long enough for that persistence of vision to go away, which is like a 24th of a second, a 30th of a second, something like that, then you wouldn't understand these boxes as moving. You would see them as, that's just a bunch of pictures of boxes. Why are you playing them to me back and back, right? Back to back. We understand this for a psychological reason, not a physiological reason. The psychological reason, it's kind of a combination. It's the beta effect and, oh crap, I always forget the other one. Oh, don't worry about it. I'll worry about it. I'll look it up later. But the beta effect basically is the same reason that when we see Christmas lights and the Christmas lights are firing off in successive order, we follow that one light. Like it just keeps like it's going like traveling in a circle around the object it's on. Like it's that we see change over time and we just perceive that as motion. The reason for that is because if you're watching somebody walking toward you, right, and you close your eyes for just a second and then open them up, and that person's closer, our brain is smart enough to understand that that previous person you saw was not destroyed and a new person was created in a different location, right? Our brain just makes that logical conclusion, probably because of centuries and centuries of not seeing people being destroyed and recreated, right? Like we just understand that like we're going to read this as the passage of time, right? At any point, I can stop this. This is still just a series of images. That is not a single box that is moving. That is multiple images of a box that, or of boxes that are drawn, right? In a way that tricks your brain into perceiving the illusion of motion, right? I need you to recognize that, like that you are kind of a motion magician, right? You are going to create the illusion of motion. And the reason for that is because once you understand that, you realize that this image is the only thing that matters, right? How you got there does not matter. If you drew it with a crayon, if it's beautiful, it doesn't matter. You got to a convincing image, right? Maya is just a tool. Right? Maya is just like a pencil. Maya is just like a crayon. And it's just a complicated tool. Right? And we're going to use that tool to craft motion. Now, I thought it would be fun just for this next exercise to kind of just play with this, right? To play with the idea of making a GIF and the many, many different ways that you can use to do that. So, if a GIF is just a series of images back to back, right? I can make those in any way I want to, right? You could literally go in and scan in your entire flipbook, right? One card at a time. Put those up into something like Giphy or one of the other GIF creators, and you can make a GIF of your flipbook. Right? That's cool. If that's what you want to do, go for it. There's other ways of doing that. You could probably just take pictures of every panel of it, one image at a time. Right? I want to show you some examples of ways that you can craft motion in kind of an interesting manner. Right? I have. Something I did just sort of as an experiment once. Sorry. Here I am. Give me a second here. So I used to live in Towson, Maryland. Or not in Towson. It was north of Towson in Hunt Valley. And every morning I would drop my wife off to work, and then I would drive back up to the studio. It's for Access where I work. And for some reason, one day I was looking at Google Maps, and I was like, oh, that's kind of neat. And then I went one step forward, and I was like, oh, it's stepping forward a little bit at a time. So I just started taking screenshots of every shot between my wife's job and my job, right? And then I just put those back to back, right? So this was my trip to work. I wasn't taking pictures of this. I was capturing this from Google Images or from Google Street View, right? And so that's where I lived, and that's where I worked. So this was just a fun little experiment. I'm like, oh, I can just put a bunch of these images together, right? You could do the same thing today. You could walk home with your camera in front of you like this, and just. Thanks, autoplay.
That's too strong.
Yeah. I'm sure whatever that song is really good. But open up your camera, hold it right here, right? Just walk home and snap a picture every 10 steps, right? And then when you get home, put those together in a sequence, and you have your trip home as if you were running it, right? Probably more faster than running, like if it's over 10 steps. That's creating the illusion of motion. It's just a bunch of still images on your phone. You can put those together, right? There's a I apparently was not quite as prepared as I thought I was. Give me 1 second here. There's an animated. Here we go. It's actually really annoying with sound, so I'm going to mute it. This is an animated film from the 80s. It was stop motion, but it was stop motion with film just around the city. And how they made it was actually pretty interesting. I'll be honest, the film is a little like boring and not that fun to watch, but it's a give it a second here. You get the idea of it. Yeah. Thing. Gotcha. There you go. Right. It's a bunch of these goblins. So they're making stop motion just by taking pictures. And then they start this like weird like broom race around the city. Right? And the way they did this was actually probably very exhausting. They just jumped up in the air over and over again and took pictures of themselves while they were up in the air, right? And then they took a few steps forward and did it again, and a few steps forward and did it again, right? And the entire film is like them kind of racing around the city like that. This kind of became a, I don't know, like a YouTube mini challenge thing that people did for a while. But recognize that you can craft that illusion of motion pretty easily. You can do it with a chair, right? You can, sit down in the chair, stick your legs straight out, right? Take a picture. Scoot a little bit forward, do it again, take a picture. And what you're going to get is you riding around in that chair with your legs sticking straight out, right? All of these are illusions, right? This is, and that's what we should be recognizing that that's kind of where special effects came from, right? You take a picture of, or you're filming somebody while they're standing in front of something, you pause it, you have them step out of the way, you start filming again, and it looks like they disappeared, right? That was early versions of special effects. So I want you to play around with this and make a GIF in whatever way you find interesting. However, a lot of you enjoy drawing, right? And so I wanted to give you a couple of options for that. I wanted to show you kind of quickly how you can use a couple of different pieces of software to make some 2D animated GIFs. And this is sort of your chance to kind of experiment around with a little bit more 2D animation. So the first one I'm going to show you is actually free. You can use it at home. It's called Piskel, P-I-S-K-E-L. So this is a free online sprite generator. I should still be signed in this account. And you'll see some of the different sprites that I've made with this, right? So here's a little dancing robot, right? Can make a little explosion. I made a, is this a running astronaut, right? This is just very short animations that I made. It actually becomes kind of addictive. Pixel art is really fun. And so I meant to make one. I made several. So just playing around with like some blue streaks, a bouncing ball. And of course my personal favorite, this is my new icon that I use for everything. So it's really easy to use. So let me show you. We're just gonna create a new sprite right now. Again, if you want to play around with it yourself, you can. P-I-S-K-E-L. We're gonna create a sprite, and we get a brush, and you see that it's painting one pixel at a time. I can make that brush a little bit bigger if I wanted to paint multiple pixels at a time, and I can choose my color here. Right? So if I wanted to use red, let's start painting some red pixels. Right. And I can even make that a little lighter. Put a highlight there, right? But this is just one frame. Whenever I want to add a new frame, I can click there, and now you'll see my animation starts flashing. Right? Now, I can also delete this, and instead of making a new one, I can duplicate this frame. So it's two versions of the same frame. If I wanted to erase parts of it on here and make it a little wider, choose my color here, make it just a little bit wider. So now you just get this weird little pulsating red ball, whatever, right? And we can zoom in to see the whole thing, right? Every new frame you make is going to give you more motion, right? You can also change the speed at which it's playing. Right now, mine's playing at 12 frames per second. So let's do one more. I'll duplicate this one. And then on this one, I'm going to continue to do the same thing. Erase a little bit off the top. Add a little bit more to the sides. All right. And then I can duplicate this one, move it down. So just get sort of a little like bobbing ball, right? If I wanted to move that up and down, I can, whatever. But this is really easy to start making some animation, right? If I wanted to slow down my frame rate, I'll play a little slower. And if I wanted to add onion skin to it, I can click here, and you can see the before and after frames as you're working, right? You can kind of see the ghosting of the one before it up there and kind of work with this, right? I swear, this is going to be something some of you are just going to fall into, and like it's just a lot of fun to me. But it's a super easy way to make an animation. And from there, you can actually export this out. That's resizing it. Let's see. Here's export. And I can export out as a GIF that loops repeatedly. Download as an animated GIF. There we go. All right. Now again, mine's coming out really small. I could scale this up by 10. Download again. There we go. So this is another option that you can use to make some repeated, infinitely repeating GIFs. Right? There's other there's other pixel art tools out there as well. You're welcome to use those if you would rather experiment. In fact, this is like probably the most open-ended assignment I ever give to anybody. You can do whatever you want, right? Whatever tactful thing you want. Like, whatever makes you excited about this. If you are interested in stop motion, like, yeah, make a little stop motion GIF. I used to make all the time. I kept Sculpey next to my desk. For those of you who are familiar with Sculpey, it's just clay. There's a bunch of old stuff. Let's see. Yeah. So I just kept like some Sculpey clay next to my desk and made little like stop motion animations, right? And this is in video form, but you could very easily do the same thing. Dude, it really wants me to listen to this Cormac video. Watch again. So this is just little like stop motion animations that I made on my desk when I got bored. And I'm just doing that so it doesn't play that next video. Whatever you want to do. So, yes.
What program do you use for the stop motion?
I'm sorry, what? Oh, the program? So I used something called Monkey Jam. I don't know that it still exists. But really, you can recognize that stop motion is also just a series of photos you take with your phone or with one of the cameras you get downstairs. So you could, for those of you who have used Premiere a little bit, you can set up your camera and just take pictures, move something a little bit, take pictures, move it a little bit, and then take those images into Premiere and edit them to play at whatever speed you want to. The sort of more of a range of additional stop motion stuff. This one was just one I did for fun. It was just a CD with a bunch of magnets and yarn connecting them together, right? So I'm giving you this assignment to experiment with. Do whatever it is you're interested in doing. Having said that, some of you are probably familiar with a couple of programs already. So Photoshop, what? Is Photoshop not on here? Am I misspelling Photoshop? Photoshop. Photoshop. There we go. So Photoshop has an animation option to it, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this. Actually, so does apparently Clip Paint Studio, if any of you on that. All you have to do, minimize a bunch of this junk, is go up to Windows, and down here at the bottom is Timeline. Right? So by default, we're going to have this thing set to a video timeline. Right? And if I drag a video in here, I can scrub through video and like paint over it one frame at a time. But I'm going to click here. Is it here? Wait, have they changed this? Add media. I don't want to add media. I want to change this to a... Oh, I'm sorry. I have to have a new frame in here. So by default, this is going to say Create Video Timeline. Don't click that. Click this little drop-down box here and say Create Frame Animation. And then click that button. And now we have a frame. Right? And if I draw a circle here on that frame, then we get that. I can add new frames just by clicking right here. Can you all see this? On the, let me resize this a little bit. Yeah. So this little new button right here, this is my timeline. I have a frame here. This is how long it's going to play it. Right now, 0 seconds means no delay at all. But if I wanted to hold it for just a little bit, or even if I want to hold it for a whole second, I can. I can click this new frame here. Right, it's going to duplicate my previous frame. Now here's the interesting thing about what's actually happening. Layers, there we go. Is what it's really doing is just adding a new layer here, right? So let me undo a little bit of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave my background. I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to draw my circle on that layer, right? So then I'm just going to duplicate that layer. And then I could move that circle, this other circle, over to here. Right? I'm going to duplicate that layer and move that circle. What is happening? That layer. Kind of like auto select turned on. There we go. Move that over to here, right? Now what my animation timeline is just me turning these layers on and off at different times, right? So if I create 3 of them, and on the first one, I turn off all the layers except for the first one, and then the second one, I turn off all the layers except for the second one, and then the third one, all of them except for the third one, right? Then what I get in that animation is that. I can control how often that loops. It's going to loop forever. I can control the speed at which that plays. I can hold each of these 0.2 seconds if I wanted to. Now, part of my proof to you that persistence of vision is bull is that if persistence of vision were true, you would not understand this as motion, right? Because the gap in time in which that changes is... I mean, I guess that's not true. If we put like a space in there where the ball had disappeared for a fraction of a second, you would not understand that as motion. And that's not true. You just do. So this can go for whatever level of complication you want to do here, right? I have something that's already kind of saved. Which is that ball bounce we worked on earlier, right? Which I just have a different layer for that ball on every frame. right? I don't know how I messed that up. There's no like contact point on that. And then I have another one, which is just my face that I warp a little bit on each frame. Right? Now, for those of you who are curious on how we're doing this, I'm just duplicating this layer. There we go. That up to the top. And then I was using this liquefy filter, which really has very few uses. And this is kind of neat because liquefy will recognize parts of your face. And so you can start doing some interesting stuff with it. Recognizing my eyelids. Ooh, makes my eyes open a little more. Okay, so just the difference between these two is going to seem to make me smile a little bit more creepily. So liquefy can get, like, you can turn off those features as well if you want to really warp it. So I think it's this show face overlay, right? And then I can use these brushes or smudge tools to do really serious deformations on it, right? I like that one. So this is, you can do whatever you want to, right? I'm just throwing out a whole bunch of stuff on here for you. Now, the last thing I'll point out, I'm going to give you only a little bit of training on this one, which is the tool we primarily use in this department for 2D animation. If any of you are interested in 2D animation, okay. So actually on my YouTube page, you'll see I taught a summer class in 2D animation. It was basically how to use this software. Actually, Julia was in there. If you're interested in checking out some of those videos, I got way more instruction on that. But we can make 2D animation in there as well. It's just called Toon Boom Harmony. But to open it, start typing Harmony, Harmo, and it says Harmony Premium. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new scene in my documents, but you'll want to be a little bit more careful with this part of it. There we go. And so, just like anything else, we have a timeline down here. We have a series of brushes, and we can start doing animation in here if we wanted to. So I can start by drawing my happy guy. It's hard to draw with a mouse. And then if I go to my next frame, he's not there anymore, right? If I click this button right here, we'll be able to see some onion skinning. And I can go over here and draw him on this side too. And you'll see that, without the onion skinning, it's just going to sort of flip back and forth, right? So you can do this as many frames as you want to. You could also just bring in frame-by-frame animation into here to edit it. What you're going to export out of here is going to be a series of images. So I'll be honest with you, this assignment that I'm giving you says to do a GIF. If it's easier for you to export it out as a video, I understand that. Don't feel like too much like you have to adhere to that GIF part of this. This gets way more complicated, though. Like, there are so many more things you can do with this. To give you an idea of that, this is... Oh, come on. Where's my... There it is. This... Sorry. This is sort of a fully finished like 2D run cycle I did as part of the class over the summer. So that's not frame by frame animation. Actually, this is a fully like rigged 2D character. They use this for a lot of different TV shows. There's a list of it on the website. I was looking at it earlier. I want to say Rick and Morty was one of them. But a handful of different animation shows, including the Simpsons movie, used it. So it is actually probably the standard software that the industry seems to be moving toward for digital 2D animation. There's still a lot of people who are doing it on pencil and paper, believe it or not. That pipeline is a little weird. Basically, what's happening is they're doing the thumbnails in as a storyboard in America, and then they outsource that out to pencil and paper animation in other countries, and they do it frame by frame, and then they bring that back to America and colorize it in Photoshop. So there's a lot of different methods in which this works, but if you're interested in doing 2D digital animation, Toon Boom is the software I strongly encourage you to start playing around with. And I can point you to some tutorials and stuff on that. So today was kind of a catch-all in terms of software or packages. You don't have to use any software at all if you don't want to. I say that. You're probably going to have to do something to convert this into a GIF, right? If I want to say, is it Giphy? G-I-P-H-Y. There we go. This is one of the softwares you can use where you just upload a series of images and you can use that to convert that into a GIF, right? However you make those images, completely up to you, right? You want to do it with your phone, you want to do it with a pencil, anything you want to do. So let's look at the actual assignment for today, just so you see it. If I go back to D2L, table of contents, assignments, it's under exercises. So not the bridge, not the cars, here we go, not the flip book, you just turn that one in. It's the GIF, and I don't have a date on that, so let's go ahead and put a date on that, which will be next class period. I guess I could just look at the calendar, but I'm not going to. So right there, we're going to look at 9/26, so September 26th, 2018. Yeah. 9. What just happened? Oh, Bush. Okay, so the GIF, using Piskel, Photoshop, Toon Boom Harmony, Giphy, or any other GIF creation tool, make a GIF. This is your chance to experiment and try some new things. Have fun with this one. The only requirement is that your GIF is made up of at least 10 unique images. So this is a pass-fail exercise, just like how I went around and checked all of your flip books. They all felt like a substantial 50 pages. I don't know, some of you may have tricked me with 48 or something. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at your GIFs and I'm going to count and see if there's roughly 10 images in there that make this up. You can go over 10. If it ends up being 150, that's cool. You had fun. Whatever you want to do, this is your chance to make some fan art. This is your chance to make a experimental film. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be 10 images that seem to move, right? So go out and have fun with it. This is due next class period. What we're probably going to do is pop them up on your screen and just sort of walk around and see what everybody got out of it. Now, a couple of heads ups. Next class period, we're starting back in Maya. Hopefully you've had a nice stretch and enjoyed your time away from it. We're going to get back in there and we're going to start seeing how we can craft animation in Maya, how we can make things move specifically the way we want to. Right? I will also tell you we have a few things coming up in the near future. I'll give you the exact dates of them. But one of them is an extra credit opportunity. We have, at the end of your time here at ETSU, you go through a class called Portfolio. Right? Portfolio is where you stand up in front of all the faculty and all the students who show up, and you give a presentation of your best work. Right? Some of it's work you did here, sometimes it's work you did for clients, sometimes it's work you did on your own. But you're presenting your work as if we were employers, and you're trying to get a job with us, right? And you need to experience that. You need to experience it for a few reasons. One is because that's where you're going to be someday, and you need to kind of know how that process looks, because you're going to start working toward that pretty much as soon as you're out of the principal's classes. Those either go a couple of different ways. One of the ways it can go, though, is it's just incredible, and you're like, wow, that's what I want to do. I want to be that person in 4 years or in 3 years, right? And the other way it can go is somebody gets up there with absolutely nothing worthwhile to look at, like they're showing like half-finished work, and we just eat them alive, right? We just like, why are you doing this? Why are you wasting our time with this? It's very painful for everybody in the entire room to watch somebody faceplant at this presentation. But it will happen. It doesn't happen every semester, but sometimes it happens more often than you just expect. Sometimes there's 3 or 4 people who just came completely unprepared. That is something you have to do when you graduate here, right? You want to be that one that's amazing, not that one that was like uncomfortable for everybody, right? So you need to go see both of those so you get an idea of which one you want to be and which one you don't want to be. So much so that I'll offer you extra credit to go. So I'll give you the details for that in a little bit. I actually have to see how the numbers work out. I'll let you know the final dates. Usually it's right before fall break. It's the week before fall break, and probably the Tuesday and Thursday nights before fall break. It goes from like 5 to like 7 or 8, something like that. And it'll be over in the Millennium Center. So I'll get the exact dates for you in that, but just recognize that's coming up relatively soon. Also, like, I'm still taking up revisions. I'm getting a couple of things in D2L straightened out first, but then I'm gonna grade here pretty soon. I would hope tomorrow. That's what I'm hoping I'll be able to get to most of the grading. Maybe some this afternoon. So you should start seeing grades showing up in D2L. And if you have questions about those, or if you're like, hey, I thought I turned that in, go check the folder first, because a lot of times people are like, hey, I thought I turned that in. And I go look in the folder, and it's not in there. And then you're like, oh, I guess I forgot to turn that in. So check and make sure, and if you had an excused absence or something and you forgot to turn it in when you got back, just let me know. We can work that out. But what I encourage you to do is sort of check D2L periodically and see as your grades are updated, read your feedback on there. And as I get the revisions, I'll update those grades in there as well. So, any questions or comments about anything? All right, y'all. Well, have a good day. Rest of the class is yours. All 5 minutes of it, or however many we have. So, let me stop this video.